That's new. Give me a second here. We're getting us live over on the Facebook side of things.
Sadly, I'm going to need these.
Looks sophisticated.
Yes.
Just had to get my first prescription for glasses this week. Feels
Oh,
like
so it begins.
yeah.
I did LASIK years ago, but it doesn't help with the old reading glass problems. I have to buy these by the bushel because they're scattered all over the ranch, and every one of them is scratched.
Yeah.
All righty. Looks like we already have people over on the chat side of things.
Oh, that's good.
I'm going to get, yes, it is. Martha and Steve Hewitt saying hello from Columbus, Ohio. Always a pleasure having you guys to watch and comment. Thank you so much, Steve and Martha. Looks like, Jason, they met you at a local restaurant. Oh, met some friends, sorry, at a local restaurant on Saturday night. They opened in 07. Esprit. What? Nice.
There was a stretch in the mid to late 2000s where, for whatever reason, there was a very similar character in the vintages with bigger, more brawny, more powerful years happening in the odd years, and these more elegant vintages happening in even years that was exactly the same here and in Chateauneuf, which made for these really fascinating comparisons of like 05 to 05 and 06 to 06 and 07 to 07. It's fun that they got to see that there were some real similarities between 07 in Chateauneuf and 07 out here. I feel like they did have a lot in common.
Yeah, that's great. That's really cool. I want to do that.
Geosynchronous wine.
Yeah, one of those quirks that like it means nothing. It's just a fluke, but it was still kind of cool to see it persist for whatever that was, 5, 6, 7 years in a row.
Pretty neat. All right, we are getting our numbers up here with people joining us over on the Facebook side of things as well. And so we'll get started here in just a second. Hopefully you guys all have something to share as far as wine to be able to talk a little bit about what makes the Paso, or I should say Adelaida District anyway, unique from that wine standpoint. So yes, I'm encouraging you guys to day drink. I'm sorry about that, but this is the Paso Wine Hour. So have some wine.
You can twist my arm.
Excellent. Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Laird. David. All right. Well, why don't we get started? Looks like we have a few people over there on the Facebook side of things. And so I think we can get rolling and people will join us as we go. So hey, everyone. Chris Toronto with the Paso Wine Hour. Thanks so much again for tuning in this week. We have a really cool show. I've been mulling this show over actually for a little while on who I'm going to get to be on for this Adelaida District. Now, if you've noticed, I've really tried hard not to duplicate guests. So we've had a few duplications, maybe even of brands, but the spokesperson might be different. It's a really short list of people that have actually been on a couple times. Believe it or not, I have not had these 3 guests on, and you would think that I would have because they are all great spokespeople for our region. They make great wines, and you would think, right? Now, we've had Tablas Creek actually featured before, but I think it was maybe Neil or maybe it was Chelsea that was on before, but not Rangeland and not Parrish family. And so I'm just excited to have these 3 gentlemen on with me today to talk about something that is very near and dear to me, which is talking about what makes our region unique. I do it mostly with journalists and with trade. But it's fun to get a few people together to share some ideas and talk about this very subject, almost in this perfect format. So welcome, Jason, Laird, and David. I want to give each of you about 30 seconds or so to say hello, who you are, where you're from, all that good stuff. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So I'm Jason Haas, partner and general manager out here at Tablas Creek. We actually bought our property out here in 1989 at a time when we were outside the boundaries, the western boundary of the Paso Robles AVA. It didn't get expanded out to include us until, 93, I think.
Yeah.
But we're one of the pioneers of the Rhone movement here, and in California in general. We're co-founded by my family and a family of French winemakers from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and we've brought over 19 different varieties from France over the years, and work with them both individually and as blends. So anyway, thanks for inviting me, Chris. Good to spend an afternoon with you, David and Laird.
Awesome. Great. And we're going to get in deeper into that origin kind of story here in a little bit, because it has everything to do really and truly with our topic today. David Parrish, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Chris. Yeah, we've had vines here since 1995, but my grandfather planted 540 acres here in 1927. I spent a lot of time with him as a child, growing up in the vineyards and stuff, and always loved this area. Came back, I was at Napa for quite a few years and came back here in 1995 and planted my vineyards. And Adelaida is really special to me. I just think that we're going to talk about it. It just produces some superior wines. We're mainly Bordeaux. We think that this is a great area for not only Rhones, but also Bordeaux's. And it's just really great to be out here in Adelaida.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, David. And Laird Foshay with Rangeland Wines. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. I bought this property in 2000 and we planted it to 30 acres in 2002. I was previously a businessman with no experience in agriculture. After 20 years, I now think of myself as an advanced beginner. But at first we were growers only and sold fruit to Justin and Vino Robles for their reserve wines, and learned a little bit about winemaking. We also run cattle and sheep on our property, so it's a diversified ranch. And we sell, so in addition, we have a wine club, a beef club, and a lamb club. We sell all three products direct to the consumer. We still sell a few grapes too.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Let's give everybody a quick orientation on where exactly the Adelaida District is. I think that's probably going to be important. I know that a lot of the people that watch maybe are already familiar, but I'm still going to throw this up here real quick, which is of course and we're going to be sharing a lot of pictures actually today, but let me get this one to full screen. All right. So Adelaida District, where I'm currently sitting anyway, is here in the downtown area of Paso. But as you can see, the Adelaida District is quite large. It's not the largest of all of the districts, of course, but it does have this east to west kind of spans that is quite a bit. And with a lot of mountainous types of topography there, of course, it is definitely going to have some of the highest peaks and really cool valleys. It is actually the home of the highest peaks of the Paso AVA at somewhere around 2,200 foot elevation, I believe it is. And our brands that we're visiting with today, well, we've got Tablas Creek actually, Laird, are you furthest west or are you furthest west, Jason?
Yeah, we're a little south and west. We're pretty much on the boundary of the Jack Creek drainage, which is at the southwestern corner of the AVA.
Yeah, so it's kind of like over here. And Jason, I think you're closer over to the A practically.
Yeah, if you follow where Vineyard Drive comes out of Templeton and where it thunks into Adelaida Road, right underneath the I in Adelaida, that's where we are.
Okay. Great. And then David, you're further east into the Adelaida District, if I remember correctly now. And so you're going to be somewhere kind of, I think this is the big curve that takes you over near Dow.
Yeah, yeah, we're just before that, 1.5 miles.
Okay, so you're right about over here in the district. And so a lot of variation as to where all of these properties are at that we're going to be talking about. But I think one of the important things before we get there is the fact that this region is really well known for the calcareous type of soil that exists in the Paso AVA. It's everywhere. It's on the substrate. Adelaida District also is where you're going to find actual limestone that exists here as well. So while there's a lot of what Jason was showing, this stuff that exists everywhere, there's also actually, I have something kind of cool. Hang on a second. Jason, your dad brought this rock to dinner at Bistro Laurent one night when we were doing a media dinner, and he left it on the table. And I said, "So do you want to take your Robert? Do you want to take your rock?" "Oh no, there's more." The vineyard. I'm like, okay.
But true words.
You know, I was like, okay, but he was talking about limestone, and this is, you know, and this was it, and this is really heavy, honestly, but it was so funny, and so I've kept it ever since because I've used it as a prop so many times. But yes, over in the Adelaida District is where you also will find actual limestone, and I think these guys know quite a bit about that. We're going to probably get into that, but let's first start though, Jason. I'd love to toss it to you first. Why the Adelaida District?
Right. So I think it's important for people to remember that, like, the idea of a district called the Adelaida District, I mean, that's a fairly recent idea. That came out in the creation of the 11 sub-AVAs that happened in the kind of mid to late 2000s. But Adelaida was an old farming village. There's an old schoolhouse and cemetery still out here. It didn't have much of a town center except for really the school, but it was considered historically the kind of the breadbasket of California, because this is an area where we're at enough altitude and close enough to the coast that there was enough rainfall to produce 2 grain crops a year, a winter grain crop and a summer grain crop. So that's, I think, a useful way of thinking about the starting point for what this region is like. This is an old agricultural area, whether it's grain in the early days, whether it's things like almonds and walnuts in the kind of intermediate days, whether it's grapes in the modern days, and there's been this kind of thread of cattle ranching running through this the whole time. But the reason that we ended up here is really because of these rocks. And when we were looking for a spot to found what would become Tablas Creek, we knew the kinds of wines we wanted to make and the grapes we wanted to grow, but we didn't know where in California was going to provide the best fit. And we were looking for similarities to the Southern Rhone, Chateauneuf-du-Pape region. And one of the things that's distinctive there is these high calcium soils that are old seabed. And my dad and the Parrish brothers had been looking for 4 years already around California. When they were driving along Peachy Canyon Road west of Paso, where anybody who's driven it knows that you're basically following this creek bed. And in order to find a place to make a flat space to make a road, they had to cut into the hillsides. And you look at those hillsides and it's just this white chalk from roadbed up to where the weeds start growing 15, 20 feet up. And the story that all of them swear it was true. My dad and Jean-Pierre and Francois Perrin swear it was true. It feels to me like it's too good a story to really be true, but they all claim it is. So they were driving around after a day of wine tasting, and my dad took one of those corners a little too fast, and Francois, who had been napping in the back seat, kind of toppled over, woke up, looked out the window, and said, "Stop! We found it." And they pulled off to the side of the road and got out and kind of dug in the hillside and kind of pulling apart the rocks and realized that this is the first place that they found these kinds of soils that they'd been looking for. So that focused our search. We ended up buying a property where, like, 4 or 5 miles north of where they originally saw those road cuts. But it is one of the most distinctive features about the Adelaida District, about West Paso in general, is that you have these kind of marine soils at the surface. You can't find them in Napa or Sonoma or Mendocino or the Sierra foothills. And while they exist in other parts of Paso and other parts of the Central Coast, they don't exist with this level of kind of concentration and density.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's probably important to note is why, I suppose, they are important. Like, what do they do in the vineyard, in essence, that helps out with what makes this region unique? And I love this little slide that actually belongs to Jason. I lifted it from one of your presentations, I think, once, in how they soak water or how they retain water. And Jason, I'll let you take this, and then we're going to toss it over to David here in a second.
Yeah, that's this is a picture that our winemaker and vineyard manager Neil Collins took August of I think it was 18, when he had been digging to put in an expansion to one of our wetlands areas, that we use to treat the winery wastewater. And this is, remember, this is August. This is 4 months after it stopped raining here. And down 6 feet, he found that kind of dark brown mud colored rock. That is exactly the same stuff as in that creamy white rock. It's just that that creamy white rock had been at the surface. And this one was down 6 or 8 feet, and it's still saturated with water. And that's not because we have a water table here. We don't, at least where we are in our property. It's not like there's a water table of an underground river flowing if you get down 5, 10, 15 feet. It's just the residual moisture that the rocks absorb from the winter rainfall and have held there like sponges, for the vines to go down and get. And it's one of the incentives for grapevine roots to get down deep, because the surface layers have dried out, and if they get down deeper, they find areas that still have moisture. And it's a great way of making sure that your vines are showing this great character of place.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I've heard you note that the one that has retained all of that moisture is somewhere around 1.5 times the weight of the one that's the pale colored one.
Yep, it is. It's really dramatic. They're sort of soft and like crumbly and mud colored, and then they dry out and they feel like they're harder and they're brighter, but really it's just because they're dry.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I want to note on this image too, which is really neat, is that you have these two calcareous shale, if you will, rocks there. One is the wet one is the dry one, sitting on top of a piece of limestone, because you can tell because it has some of that calcite and that veining. That I think, was really important actually to David. David, one of the first images that you shared with me, and I know that when I've taken journalists out to visit your property, we come to this wall right here. This is a little focal point for you. Talk a little bit about what brought you to the Adelaida District. I'm guessing it's this stuff right here as well. And what's so important about this stuff?
Yeah, and this is to kind of play off of Jason, this is what his parents saw when they were driving along. It looks like rock, and it actually feels like rock, but it's rather light. And Jason mentioned that it's a marine sediment. And if you could show that, and look how thick it is and deep it is. If you go to the next slide, I've got a little plaque there. And really what you're looking at is this white soil, is calcareous limestone. And these high calcium soils were found in many of France's well-known regions, and like the Loire and the Rhone valleys, and of course Bordeaux. But this soil was actually created, this sediment, when this was all under the ocean, and sea life, of course, was bountiful, and over millions of years deposited this calcium carbonate. And then of course this was all lifted up, and we get to enjoy this as far as the minerality and adds to the intensity of the wine. But to your question, yeah, it is about the terroir, or the soil, that really had me come out to Adelaida and try to improve our wines. And you can see it in the soil on the right there. You can see it's just all broken up right underneath the vines, and the vines are constantly, pulling this calcium out, and that is so important. We're mainly Bordeaux, but it's important for all these varieties. Is that calcium so important for the skin, development of the skin of the grapes? And of course, that's where you get your flavors. The pulp, of course, is where you get the sugar and the alcohol, but really it's the skin where you get the phenolics, and that's the color, the tannins, and the depth of the wine. And it just creates an incredible red wine that I think it's above all other wines of California, to be honest with you.
Awesome. I also understand though that with those high pHs in the mid 7s and up to 8 have an inverse effect then when it comes to the acidity that you find in grapes.
Well, that's a good point. I have grapes in two other areas, the El Pomar and Creston, where we worry about the acids dropping out, but in Adelaida, our acids are always a little bit high. And so we have to work with much higher acids, very similar to Bordeaux. And that's a great shot. When we go and we rip the soil to be able to open it up and plant, all this stuff comes up in these big chunks. I actually sent men out with big sledges and broke up 90% of it, but some of it's so dense and hard. They said, boss, we can't break it. So we pulled those out and we made, walls here and there. So it's interesting stuff. It really is. But
Yeah.
it really is all about the wine.
Yeah.
We've recently learned kind of chemically what's happening. The reason why these high calcium soils have you retain better acidity in your grapes, it's because with all of that calcium, it basically inhibits the vine's ability to take potassium, basically is displacing potassium.
Makes
And
sense.
potassium is one of the critical minerals that grapevines use in the ripening process to help break down acids. So you're basically inhibiting the vine's abilities to break down acid, even as you're getting good hang time and you're increasing your flavor intensity. So it's one of the reasons why these kinds of soils are so prized in so many of those great regions that David had on that plaque.
Yeah, that's great. Laird, you were saying that you are an advanced, I think you said beginner, when it comes to some of what's happening, here. But you must have had some knowledge though ahead of time though to decide that's a pretty good piece of land that you'd like to plant grapevines on. I mean, what drew you to the area?
One of the things that makes the west side so attractive is the huge oak trees and the sort of verdancy of the area in the winter and the spring. And that's when I first saw my ranch. And so it was a case of general attraction to the abundance of the land. And you could see it in the pasture grass that was waist deep. And it's unusual that valley oaks, which are normally a riparian kind of tree, grow in the ridge tops in the Adelaide on this rich limestone soil. And those are many of the same soil that were cleared and planted to vineyards over the last 100 years. So, and this scene here of a valley with a small lake in it, just inside the coastal mountains, is where, I first fell in love with the Adelaide. And it reminded me, I grew up in the Bay Area, and it reminded me of Portola Valley, but kind of minus the people and the development. And I had a chance I had sold a business and had a chance to buy this land, and I was basically a goner for it. The business case was that we would take a cattle ranch and take 40 out of the larger acreage and put grapes on it because that was a higher use. And there were so many wonderful things happening. And I began as a grower planting grapes in that area. And I'll summarize the vineyard. We're just southwest of Tablas Creek, and where you see that road running along the sort of upper part of my vineyard, that's the center of Limestone Ridge, which is the last ridge of limestone as you go southwest in Paso Robles. It's really the end. It's might call it the capstone, or it might be the basement. I'm not sure exactly how the whole stratigraphy works, but
that's interesting.
But and then just down below those dark blocks, which are planted to Cabernet, there's a beltline road, and right along there, and there's a little notch in block 6A. That is a serpentine outcrop, and it's interesting that so those two. If you go back to a couple slides there, Chris, that is limestone. So the white rock creates a dark, rich soil that's high in pH and creates extremely low, fresh, acidic wine. So there's ironies: light rock, dark soil, high pH soil, low pH wine, and relatively easy to grow on. It's a rich clay loam, holds water, doesn't take much irrigation, and delivers a moderate vine growth. The next slide, on the lower part of my vineyard, the whole scene changes, and this happens in the Adelaide from hill to hill, but this is really the end of the limestone. As you go southwestward, you see at the bottom of the vineyard a very light, and already I took this picture this week, and already in springtime from the soil being worked, it's turning powdery and easily compacted. It's very droughty. You can see some of the vines are struggling at the end of the row. completely different picture. The vines grow less easily, they produce less fruit, and they create a much softer and richer style of wine, unlike the limestone. And then what gets really curious is between these two terrains is a ridge of rock, which is serpentine. And you can see here, this is a block 4 Malo, and you can see it's having a lot of trouble in the middle foreground there. And that's because there's gravelly serpentinitic outcroppings there. And the soil is basically toxic. It's high in magnesium and iron, Ma, Fe, MAF, ultramafic soil. And what's particularly interesting about that is serpentine is state rock of California. It's kind of one of the signature rocks of the Franciscan Formation, which runs up through the Coast Ranges all the way through San Francisco. And it basically forms kind of a western margin to the San Andreas Fault. And it is interesting from a natural historical point of view, because some of these rocks they're metamorphic igneous rocks that were created up to 200 million years ago. And then as the Pacific Plate arrives at North America and subducts under at the San Andreas Fault, this material has been scraped off over the eons. And in fact, I've been told by some geologists that the serpentine and cherts that occur on my property were from not even the Pacific Plate, but from the preceding plate, the Farallon. So what from the wine point of view? Well, tough to farm, for sure, but also that it's kind of interesting that we think we get a different flavor profile and a more earthy complexity from that. And that's why there's a wine that we call Ultramatic. It's 100% Merlot from that block. And we think we get a kind of rich, earthier style of wine, in addition to the kind of fruity suavity of a nice California Merlot. So the much maligned California Merlot, right? But we think we're getting a very nice, if not brilliant, wine off that very difficult to farm ground. So I totally agree that the story of the Adelaide is primarily limestone, and that's the big producer in our vineyard and produces the distinctive acidic style. But there's a kind of, in the Adelaide, it totally depends which hill you're on, and there are infinite blending opportunities from these different terrains, terroirs, and I think that's why Paso is a puzzle that is, still unfolding and creates great opportunities.
It makes a lot of sense too that you have, since you're in that southwestern corner and you're butted up right up against where really what we're looking at is where the Santa Lucia Mountain Range peaks and falls, because as it gets closer to the ocean and pretty much all along the coastline, that's all serpentine rock that exists right up to the water's edge. Green
and sandstone,
blue rock.
And this very, very tough to farm too. Wow, my hat tips to you. That's a tough one.
Well, if I knew then what I knew now, and I had some inklings, because of course there were studies done of the soils, and they mentioned ultramafic rocks, and me being an enthusiastic beginner, it was sort of full sail ahead.
Hey, we all are beginners, We're all
right.
beginners.
So, but really, wine blending and making, I am not the winemaker. We have a brilliant young winemaker, Paul Hinchberger, who's doing a great job. I think of myself as more the wine grower, although I farm less than I once did. And but sometimes you can't plan what you get. You have to deal with what you get, and you discover things that lead to very fine and interesting wines.
For what it's worth, I wanted to show a piece of what serpentine rock looks like. And so here's basically it's blue-green, so that veining in there of the green blue. This is taken from Pico Creek over on the coast, so it's not from Laird property, but it's basically the same material as what you would find there, I believe, right, Laird?
Yeah, it's hard and gravelly. There's all kinds of colors in it, blue and green, and That's kind of a river rock polished version. It's often
Mhm.
very angular on site, and it gets the serpentine name. In fact, there's even a subtype called, I think, lizardite, which it has a kind of reptilian sheen, and it's a tool breaker as well. Of course, you get
Oh, yeah.
you get the wrong shank
It's
stuck in
hard.
that
Oh
stuff.
man, is it hard? Oh geez.
Yeah, so it's erratic and exotic relative to a lot of Paso soils, but it also has kind of a hidden gift in it, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. A hidden gift. I like that.
I think the Rock Club also calls it the Lieberite. Right there, collecting. Hey, let's get into what we're drinking. I see we're all sipping on some wines. We're about halfway through, believe it or not. I'd love to know what you're drinking and give me some descriptors of what we're finding in this wine that comes out of these soils that we've been talking so eloquently about. Jason, what were you having there?
So I brought both a white and a red. I know that a lot of people do think of Paso as being red wine country, and certainly the majority of what's in the ground is, but I do feel like particularly these soils and the way that they encourage the grapes to retain acidity, it is at least as valuable for whites as it is for reds. And so the white that I have in my glasses are Tablas Blanc, which is, again, pretty classic for what we do. It's a white Rhone style blend of Viognier and Grenache Blanc and Marsanne and Roussanne, kind of balancing Viognier's lushness and fruitiness with Grenache Blanc's brightness and Marsanne's elegance and Roussanne's kind of structure, and it keeps everything else in order. And then the red that I had first, just because we just released it this week and we haven't made it in a few years and I wanted to try it, is our Terre Noir, which is a super obscure variety that there's like 100 acres of in France, and we've got half an acre here on the estate at Tablas Creek. It's one of the only Terre Noir plantings outside of France, but it's a kind of a pale, floral, spicy, fairly tannic red that reminds me of like an alpine grape that you might find in the Jura, like Poulsard or something like that. A red grape that has like tension and tannin and brightness and like red to pink flowers. It's a cool, interesting, weird, wild grape that's one of the many experiments that we've brought in from France, and we're trying to figure out just how it translates into a place like this.
Cool. You guys went through so much to be able to bring all of that material, that plant material over from France through the quarantines and all of that kind of stuff. So that way you can ensure that there was, disease free and all that. And what was it? 22 varieties? Is that right?
So we've brought in 19.
19.
Depending on how you define it, there's like 22 or 23 or 24 different grapes allowed in the Rhone. 13, somewhere between 13 and 18 allowed in Chateauneuf. It's just a question as to whether you count something like Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, and Grenache Gris as separate grapes or one grape, is how you get those, like the imprecise numbers that I'm giving. But yeah, we've brought over all 14 of the Chateauneuf grapes that they have in the ground at Beaucastel, and then a handful of other things like Viognier and Marsanne that are allowed in Côte-du-Rhône, but not in Chateauneuf.
Got it. So you had a very focused kind of mission in what you wanted to plant there after seeing these soil types, after equating it to some of the regions, in old world regions and the like. Did you find though that of any of those varieties that you were planting that maybe they didn't work in this soil types, or that they were challenged in any way?
So short answer is no. There are varieties that we have found that do better, we feel, here than they do in the Rhone. And it's mostly because of this combination of soils and how cold the nights are. We haven't talked a lot about weather, but that's one of the other really distinctive things about where we are, is that we can have a diurnal swing, the difference between the daytime high and the nighttime low, that might be 45 degrees during the growing season. So those same days where it's 95, it's going to drop down to 50 at night. So the combination of those cold nights and these calcareous soils have meant that we're picking grapes on average a week to 10 days later than they do in Chateauneuf at the same sugars with higher acids. So that's particularly valuable for things like Grenache Blanc that are famous in the Rhone for being like prone to being soft and big and kind of a little heavy. So you got to blend them with other stuff. So it's, I think in general, there are things that we're still waiting to see if that higher acid will end up translating in the way that we're used to it translating in the Rhone. I mean, even 30 years in, we're still figuring out things like Grenache. I mean, we get a different expression of Grenache here than they do in Chateauneuf because you have so much more tension in the wines here. They don't get quite the plushness that you get in a place like the Southern Rhone. But by and large, there's nothing that we've tried and been like, yeah, oops, sorry, that didn't work. And there are several things that we feel like that combination of soil and climate is a real asset.
Yeah. And I think that's a testament to Paso. I mean, for everybody watching, we have about 64 different varieties that are grown here. We've got a lot of diversity in our soils and in our climate and so many things. I mean, it's 614,000 acres. You're going to have some kind of, different things that are going to happen between the 11 districts, 12 if you want to include York Mountain as well. So we have this an ability to grow a lot of different things and accomplish a lot of different things with those varieties. And I love hearing how Jason and over there at Tablas figured out how maybe some are even doing even better. I wanted to share though, real quick, everybody, a little bit. Jason had mentioned how we could cool off. So I'm sipping on a Summerwood Marsanne here that is from the Alta Colina Vineyard, and that's where we were just a second ago. Whoops, a second ago, which is this vineyard here. It's an amazing vineyard. I mean, the topography, the scale of the incline, I should say, of the hills there. I mean, it's an incredible piece of property that this grape was sourced from. But and this is a nice image of how steep things can get. You can see that horizon line almost just dropping off there, going down into that little oak filled valley and then right back up the next hill over. But this is a great depiction of how it does get cool at night through fog. And I'm sure, Laird, you're probably seeing a lot of this since you're butted up right against that last ridge line.
It's interesting. There are contrasts. So this morning is a good example. There was a marine layer that came in, I believe, from Monterey all the way down King City and over the Paso airport and generally in the area. But we had a bluebird morning up here because our vineyard is mostly between 15 and 1,800 feet. And it's in a back valley. It's higher in the salinas drainage, and many of those marine layer days do not reach. So it really depends which hill you're on and what your aspect is in terms of warmth. And we have more canopy growth generally in the Adelaide. I have a mostly southwest facing vineyard at this point on top of the stake. I see other people, much earlier in bloom, that kind of thing. It depends. So you can be more coastward and be warmer. You might not be as hot at the peak, but you have an earlier, your growing season is realized earlier. You may break bud a little earlier, bloom a little earlier, and I harvest most of my Cabernet in September. Whereas a much hotter area east of the Salinas River, they might be harvesting Cabernet more centered around October 15th and even into early November because of lower lying ground, colder air, more marine layer. Now we do see the marine layer come over from the coast, but that marine layer has to get over 3,000 feet deep before it piles over. Whereas a 1,200 foot marine layer from Monterey will come down and blanket all the way to Templeton, all the way to the Cuesta Grade, and not cover the Adelaide on some days.
Yeah.
This is a picture that I have from the top of Tablas Creek looking toward where Laird is. So this is looking west and a little bit south. And you can see the barrier that Santa Lucia, the peaks of the Santa Lucias make for those fog banks that are sitting over the coast most of the summer. So, I live in town, and I would say that in town, we probably have foggy mornings 5 times for every foggy morning there is out at the vineyard, just because in town it's 700 feet in elevation, and where we are at Tablas is 1500. So it's a much deeper marine layer that's needed in order to get that fog over the mountains and all the way fill up that whole valley and all the way get back to us.
Yeah, that's an incredible shot. I often equate that. I call it like the fog monster. That's this, its big fingers or tentacles coming over the mountain range. It's incredible. David, we're going to get to what you're sipping on here in just a second, but you have an interesting in that you're farming over in the Adelaida district, but you're also farming in another district. Talk a little bit about those climate variations, since we're kind of talking about climate right now, of what you see in Adelaida versus what is it Creston? I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Yeah, Creston and also El Pomar. I have 2 other vineyards.
Okay.
And, just what they were saying is that the temperatures, I have a bigger swing as far as colder mornings and warmer afternoons in both the El Pomar and Creston. It's a little more temperate here, but you still get a good swing. But where I harvest here in Adelaida, the middle of September, the Cabernet, like Laird was saying, I'll be lucky to harvest by the middle of October to the end of October in both the Templeton area and the Creston area. So it's really unique that you would think the hotter area would ripen quicker, and that's typical with most fruit. But for these vines in Adelaida, the little bit softer mornings and the lack of fog in the afternoon makes a huge difference. And my canopy is beautiful here. It really grows really nice here. And also the fruit set seems to be better because of the moderation of the temperature during flowering. I'll tell you what, it's like a Goldilocks here. It really is.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are you sipping on? Let's talk about that wine and what makes it unique coming from the Adelaida district.
Well, this is our 2016, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's very, very dark, and it's like a blue-black. When I worked in Napa those years, and we were always looking for not red fruit in Cabernet, but more of a blue-black. And here it just happens. I mean, it's very easy, quite frankly, compared to most of the other fruit that I get off my other ranches to get this blue-black color. And that's where your phenolics are so strong coming out of these nice calcium thick skins that we have. In fact, I have to pull my fermentation. I have to take it off the skins early, which most people may not know how we do that, but we actually are always pumping over through the skins to get more and more phenolics, where if I'm not careful, I'll get too much phenolics. And the other vineyards I don't have that problem. It's unbelievable here. It really is.
Wow, that's wild. Do you have the label to show us by any chance of the bottle?
I didn't bring one. I just made sure I had something to drink.
All good. We're going to encourage everybody, of course, to go to your websites at the end of the show. Also, just let you know, I know that there's some questions floating out there. We'll get to you, I promise. Laird, what are we sipping on? What's happening over there?
I have a glass of that Ultramatic that I mentioned. It's 100% Merlot, grown on, that block is Serpentine influenced, but because it's on a bench, it has limestone ground overlaying some of it, and the toe of it's in the sandstone. So it's really, it's a crazy difficult block to farm. But as I say, we pick it several different times as a result. We use some of that fruit. Sometimes we pick it early for the rosé because it's in a deep green swale, and there's a lot of variety. But the Ultramatic, we made a dark red expression of Merlot. There's not much of that rubiness that you get, say, with a less intense Merlot. It's more in the darker hue, and that's where the flavor profile is. And then I get a little funk off the wine, a little complexity, a little hint of more of a French wine, more so than most other California Merlots, and I really like that. There's a famous, if you folks are interested in geography, I brought one of my favorite tomes. It's a book called Annals of the Former World, and it describes plate tectonics, California geology. And it talks about a certain, it may be because of the power of suggestion, I'm susceptible to that, but the author, John McPhee, and this is a Pulitzer Prize winner, by the way, was drinking a Serpentine wine with a famous geologist, which is basically how he wrote the book, which is traveling around with geologists. And he described the scent of the wine as having a kind of a low tidal kind of funk to it. And that put an idea in my head that I really stowed away for years and recollected when we started to make a varietal Merlot off that Serpentine influence block. One other comment I'll make is we don't grow any white wine grapes, but for the last couple of years, we've bottled a Sauvignon Blanc from the Parrish family vineyard on Adelaide Road there. And people are often really pleased and note how refreshing the wine is for what's basically a hot climate, Sauv Blanc, but it's not a heavy, fruity California style necessarily. It's much more bracing and mineral driven. And we just get a lot of compliments on that wine. And it's a great example of how you can grow a wine that might be perceived as more coastal in style in a hot climate because of the calcium influence of the limestone soils.
Thank you, Laird. That's true. That really is a nice little block, and the Sauv Blanc really has nice characteristics.
And I think one of the things that we've been learning is, I know we got thrown by this like everybody else did and does into thinking that Paso was a fairly hot region. Just went in and did some climate analysis. The average summer temperatures in Paso are 5 degrees cooler than in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And that's not because the days are cooler. They're not. The days are as warm or a little bit warmer on average, but the nights are 15 degrees cooler than they are in the south of France. So it's important to remember that even if your days are hot, the grapevines are paying just as much attention to what's going on at night as they are to what's going on during the day. So I think one of the things that I feel is important is that people not be surprised by the cooler climate aspects in Paso Robles wines, particularly in those regions where there's the combination of that huge diurnal drop in nighttime temperatures and these calcareous soils, because you get, and again, we pick later than they do at Beaucastel, and we pick with the same sugars and higher acids. It's it has at least as many aspects of cool climate viticulture as it does with warm climate viticulture.
Yeah, that's a good point. I see that too, and that we may get a little warmer during the day, but our mornings are cooler, and it's actually a very mild temperature through the overall day, to tell you the truth.
And grapevines don't photosynthesize very well until you get up above 75 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't photosynthesize optimally until you get above 85 degrees. So it's between like 85 and 95 that they do their peak photosynthesis. And you think of what a Paso day is like in the middle of the summer, it's going to start out at 55. It might not hit 80 until noon. And then you've got maybe a few hours where it's in that sweet spot. And then maybe it's even going to get hotter than that sweet spot and slow down photosynthesis. And then it's going to come back down, it's have another sweet spot in the evening, but the sun is super low at that point, and then it's cold again at night. So you have fewer of those hours where the grapevines are really just accumulating sugar as fast as they can, which helps lengthen the growing season, keep the grapes on the vine longer. I mean, and I think there's lots of benefits to that beyond just the acidity in the wine. You get more time on the vines, you get more minerality, you get more character of place.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do have this really good long growing season. I'm curious as to when maybe bud break was for you guys, and then what are you thinking as far as harvest? When do you think harvest is going to start? Laird, I'd love to start with you.
I thought this year, it may not have been the first year, but it was versus some of the drought years and some of the warmest winters where we saw freaky early bud break sometime earlier in March. Ours was right around traditional, the first week in April kind of thing. And then despite the fact that we had far lower than average rainfall, the atmospheric river that hit us in January and in my ranch at my vineyard, we clocked 15 inches of rain in 2 days out of a total of 18 for the year. So it was really, really odd. But because it's another soil story, because the relatively good water holding capacity of limestone clay loams, I think we got a lot of benefit from that. And we're seeing a fairly brilliant beginning to the growing season, despite coming off a really droughty winter. So fingers crossed, I think we're going to see a traditional veraison and harvest. And for us, that would be, veraison in early August and harvest mostly in September.
How about you, David?
Yeah, I saw pretty much the same thing. In fact, my Malbec is already fruit set. It looks really good. My Syrah is just about done. So to me, it looks like an average year. I was a little concerned because of the coolness that we've had here last week and the week before, but the vines just, once they reach your point, they don't seem to mind. They just keep trugging. And so I think it's going to be a very good year. Pretty much what I like is average picking will be around September, middle of September.
Cool. Jason.
Yeah, it's we're seeing the same stuff. I mean, it is neither a particular noteworthily early nor late year. Conditions have been pretty benign so far. We've only had a couple of days that have touched 90, which is fairly unusual for late May. Often we've gotten at least kind of one hot stretch. Haven't really this year yet. We did get a little bit of frost damage from the cold nights last week. Not a lot, but just kind of a few little sections that got singed a little bit. But by and large, I mean, things so far so good. I think I'm just hoping that it stays with this relatively low stress year where it hasn't been super hot. I mean, we know that we're starting at a little bit of a water deficit because we did get. I mean, we were at like 16 inches of rain for the winter, and 12 of those were in that one storm in 48 hours. So it did almost all get absorbed in. So it's not like just because it came fast, it ran off. It didn't on these soils, but still, we know that that's only like 60% of what our normal annual rainfall is. So the longer that we can keep relatively low stress on the vineyards, the better. We know it's going to be stressful. It's always stressful here by the time you get to harvest time, but I'm not expecting anything super unusual in terms of veraison or harvest.
Yeah, I'd love to get to a couple questions here. I do have one sitting here that's been waiting a little while, and it was asking about what Bob Lindquist's role was possibly in getting Tablas getting your dad and the Perrin family to look at Paso.
So he was basically he was somebody who my dad had known and who volunteered to be kind of tour guide in the Central Coast for my dad and Jean-Pierre and Francois. So yeah, they were tooling around Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo County with Bob in 1988, 89. And it was at the tail end of one of those trips that they were on that Peach Canyon Drive. It was not with Bob, sadly, because I would love to hear whether he says that really happened. But no, I mean, he was said that we're lucky as the Rhone movement to have so many of those pioneers still with us, still doing great stuff, from him to Randall Graham to Bill Easton to Gary Everly. So it's I guess that's one of the benefits of being a part of a movement that's only like 40 years old in and of itself, is that those guys who are pioneering it in their 20s and 30s are still doing cool stuff. But yeah, Bob was a really critical piece of that beginning search in those early years.
Awesome. That's cool. I love getting into speaking of this is just kind of coming from a little bit of what you just said. I love getting into some of the backgrounds of our guests at times. And we have just a little bit of time left, but I'd love, David, you were talking earlier about when your family planted and everything, and that you were up in Napa and all that, but your trajectory, I suppose, into this industry, was a little different in that you were involved more on, what was it, trellising? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. When I graduated from Davis, the hot topic was trellising. Back then, they just used, little wooden stakes and little 3-foot cross arms, 2-foot cross arms. And So I came out with some interesting designs back then when I got out of college and started a trellis company. And I was doing some work, and my professor, Dr. Cleaver, asked me to put in a little 5-acre plot of different trellises around the world. So I did it. And he had me I allowed me to put a small test plot of my own in design. So some people from Napa, this was in 1980, they'd won the award in 1976. Everybody knows about that. Well, some people from Napa came to Davis, and they said, we want to start pulling out some of our vineyards because we're on a world stage now. We need to, they were 8x12 vine spacing. They were on AXR rootstock. I mean, bad clones. I mean, here they were in a world stage, but they did not have the vineyards to support it. So some guys came from Napa, and they talked to Dr. Cleaver, and they saw my work. And a guy by the name of Robert Mondavi called me and said, hey, I liked your work. Why don't you come to Napa and help me, develop my vineyards? I told him no, I was too busy. I was 23 years old. You're busy at that age. So my professor called me and said, not a good career move. You need to go to Napa. So I said, well, I'll go for you, because I wanted to go back to Paso, because my grandfather was here. And so I went there. I was going to be there a year. I was there 20 years. That was a long year. But I got to put in, all the Fay vineyards there at Stag's Leap and all these others. And I met some great people. I mean, going out to drink wine with all these guys and tasting wines. And the hardest part, though, is these guys would order 5, 6, 7 bottles of different wines to taste, and only drinking, half of it. That was hard on me, being 23 years old. But it was a great education because these guys were going through all these wines and explaining them to me and so forth. At the time, to be honest with you, I didn't realize what was going on. But of course, that transferred into eventually coming back to Paso and putting my own vineyards in. And yeah, it was a fun ride.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Laird, you had mentioned earlier you were a businessman up in the Bay Area, but what were you doing? Because I don't think it was farming.
No, it wasn't. One other comment on the Napa Paso connective tissue. The vineyard that I have is designed by John Crossland, who was the grower manager for Andy Beckstoffer in the valley, as I understand it, for years, and was kind of the new cowboy in Paso, and I was a new guy out of the Bay Area. So, the DNA is crossed over in multiple places, and we have an influx of talent in Paso over the last 20 years that's led, aside from the great ground that we've got, to all the wonderful wines that exist. So. Yeah. But I was not in farming. I was in publishing. Really, I published magazines for a niche audience of software developers in the early 80s. A crazy thing called Dr. Dobbs Journal, published by the People's Computer Company. It was my first employer. And it was part of the early stages of the open source movement. So a completely different world. But the exciting thing was it was at the very beginning of the personal computer movement. And these guys were tool makers for the trade of software development and had crazy schemes about object-oriented languages and that kind of thing. So it was very exciting to be in that world and hear the stump speeches from the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobses and all that stuff. As a young man who had studied history, and I had no background in technology, but I was in sort of the business side of publishing in a very niche world, and that world became very big, and I was happy to ride that tide. And then I did a small startup, very small venture-backed startup. After I published magazines for 10 years, I never wanted to see another magazine. And I did an online publishing venture, which licensed investment newsletters and put them on the internet in the very early days. So it was part of that dot-com investor boom, very small company, 25 people. So I was always a niche business person and publisher. Interestingly, the business model that supported those activities was subscriptions. And I now find myself in the wine subscription business, the beef subscription business, and the lamb subscription business. Recurring revenue and direct to consumer is the way to go.
Awesome. Jason, you're no stranger to tech as well. And I think maybe during that time that the Road Cut story it was formulated, or real or not real, or whatever that might be, this legend that was developed. I think you were in DC, is that right?
Yeah, so when they were looking for property, I was in high school, so it was not. I grew up in Vermont. I was an East Coast kid. That was where the wine importing business that my dad was running, was based. Um, I had the luxury, the cool opportunity to spend summers working in the cellars of a lot of those French suppliers whose wines he was bringing in. So that was my introduction to wine. It was not California. I didn't come to California for the first time until I went out to look at colleges. But meanwhile, my dad and the parents had bought this property. My first significant amount of time out here was in January of 1995, when, as an undergrad studying architectural design, I came out to design a house for the vineyard property. And I was out here for 2 weeks, and it rained every single day for those 2 weeks that I was here in January. I remember landing in San Luis Obispo and thinking, this looks like Ireland, not like California. But yeah, I ended up going from there into getting recruited by a tech firm, the height of that first tech bubble, and ended up teaching web programming languages for 4 years and helping manage a company that did that. Not that is super relevant to what I do right now, except for that it's still a business that you've got to run, and it still has aspects of marketing and management and communication and all those pieces. So my role here is not to be the winemaker or to be the grape grower. We've got a great winemaker, we've got a great viticulturist, we've got people who are in charge of that. My job is to make this work as a business and to understand enough about all the pieces that I can evaluate the decisions that everybody's making and make sure that they're talking to each other and listening to each other, and that we've got a vision of where we want to go and what we want to be, and we have the relationships and the resources to make that happen. So I had what I would call a detour in tech rather than a career in tech, but the starting point and the last 20 years have been pretty firmly planted in the wine business.
Yeah, and I love these lineage stories, you guys. I think it's amazing. I think that's what makes the fabric of Paso so incredible and complex. It's like a layered wine, or if you will, you have all of these different notes and all of these different aspects of who what a wine might be and who we are as a region. And thank you so much, you guys, for coming on today and sharing your stories and talking about the Adelaida District. We started there, we digressed a little, but it's always fun though to share the personality of our region in these. I think that's what people do appreciate of it. So cheers to you. Thank you so much for being on today. And we're gonna hang on, can't cheers and not drink.
Hold on, my glass is empty.
You can't cheers with an empty glass.
The talk has been too successful and thirst inducing.
Hey,
awesome.
I could add a short footnote to that career background thing, Chris, and I think it's something a lot of our visitors and wine tasters appreciate. The modern world is full of intellectual property and virtual experiences, but I think what people love about Paso Robles is the groundedness of it, the beauty of it, the friendliness of it. And after going from an entirely intangible business, publishing, to an entirely tangible life, and being able to share that with other people and give and share with them wines that express that and lubricate the whole experience, let's say that. I feel very privileged to be able to do that. And I'm really glad that people are coming to Paso in increasing numbers to taste that.
Yeah, awesome.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah, nice. Very nice, Laird. Thank you.
Steve Hewitt, you wanted to know what I'm drinking. It's a Summerwood Marsanne 2016 from the Alta Colina Vineyard. So yes, I never did put that label on, but up there. But yeah, thank you for catching that before we jumped off. Everybody, thanks for joining us today for the Paso Wine Hour. Next week, we're taking it off because it takes actually a team to do this. And we have some people off next week in the office. And so I will be taking it off as well. But we will be back the following week with a what's happening in the vineyard. We'd like to do that every few weeks or so we can update you guys on what's happening this vintage. I know we got some great updates today already, but we'll be doing that with a few vineyard managers from around the region. And then I think it's on the 17th, we have another one of those taste-a-thons where Wine Origins, that group that helps to solidify and ensure that there's honesty and truth in labeling out there in the great big world of wine internationally, we're going to be participating on their taste-a-thon. And so we're going to have a few winemakers on from, I think so far we've got Laventure and Law that are going to be a part of it. And we're going to get a third one to talk a little bit about their wines and about their international ties, which are pretty good. We'll see you next time on the Paso Wine Hour. Go to pasowine.com to see what the upcoming shows are. Go watch past shows. And also you can click on wineries and you can get to all of these wineries, the Parrish Family Vineyard, Rangeland Wines, and Tablas Creek. You can find them on there and go directly to their websites. Again, thank you guys. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Nice job.
Thank you. Really
Right on.
nice.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you.